Hello everyone, I am Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with the third installment in my quickie series on moving up the limits, and today we'll be discussing No Limit 100. No Limit 100, home of the Nit Reg. Most regulars have moved up to No Limit 100 by excelling at doing two things. Number one, running well. People who run well win and move up, people who run poorly quit. No Limit 100 is still easily within the I've been playing 100,000 hands of poker and I've run well during it. So you're going to play against a lot of bad regulars at No Limit 100 because they've just run well at No Limit 25 and No Limit 50. So hopefully if you're moving up to the limit, that makes you a little bit less nervous about it because you're still going to play a lot of really bad regulars. Number two, beating fish. There are enough fish at lower limits and regulars are bad enough that a mediocre nit can still win money and even pretty decent money. The Nit regular's strength lies in his ability to correctly make big folds against most players and not tilt or spew. So, most regulars are not capable of making big bluffs, and the Nit's kind of just okay with folding his overpairs, maybe even finds hero folds with two pairs sometimes. So he makes these disciplined folds most other players don't make, and then when he ends up flopping, a set against someone else's overpair, he hopes he gets to stack them and he slowly wins money. This player wins by others playing poorly, not by playing well himself. We will crush these types of players by having a 5 times better understanding of poker and a willingness to make big plays and big bluffs against the right players. This player will not be able to move up, and we will be. We have already positioned ourselves so we will not get stuck at No Limit 50 to No Limit 100 and don't need to relearn the game. So someone that doesn't really understand poker, and he's just trained himself to make disciplined folds, which is what a lot of No Limit 100 regulars have done, they are going to get stuck here. Because there are too many other players using the same strategy, there's still a rake, and there's not as many fish as there were at a stake like No Limit 25. So they're going to be in a lot of trouble here, and we're going to take a bunch of their money, and we already have our game sort of set up that we can continue building on our game and not only beat the No Limit 100 players, but move up and beat No Limit 200 players too. Time for big bluffs! ! Now it's time to start making some big bluffs. We can no longer only barrel on scare cards. Many opponents are used to no one bluffs here and a pair isn't good, and it's time to single them out and make them fold. Randomizing well is absolutely crucial to making this work. I very, very rarely will pull a big bluff with bad randomizers. This is okay to do, but be extremely careful with this. So, just straight up, there's some players that are better than I am that can just look at someone's stats. They know how the game is flowing, and they're like, okay, this is a really good spot to bluff. It's going to get enough folds, even if they have really, really bad randomizers. So that makes it a bad bluff in theory, but it's a good bluff in practice. Most people who say they can do this, I think, are actually kind of full of it, and they actually can't, and they're just trying to make an excuse for playing poorly. But there are some players that are legitimately really good at pulling big bluffs, even with really bad hands. I'm not one of them, and I wouldn't recommend you do it either, unless you're really sure the bluff's going to work. And the reason for that is getting the nuts 10% of the time on the river for free is a huge deal. It's a really, really important thing to do. So if you use good bluff randomizers on the flop, you might run a runner a straight or run a runner a flush like 12% of the time. If you use complete garbage, you're going to run a runner something maybe 3% of the time. That extra 10% jump is very, very important, and in order to pass that up, you need a really good reason to do that. I've never really been able to get it to work, to be honest with you. I always pretty much have to randomize decently well. This is hard to do at first and extremely high variance, but there's no way to get around this. So, acknowledge that if you're moving up past No Limit 50, you're no longer just sort of letting other people make mistakes, maybe exploiting the sort of obvious leaks your opponents have. You're going to have to start randomizing big bluffs, and sometimes that's going to cost you a lot of money when they don't work. Learning big bluffs will likely be negative EV at first. Hard concepts such as Donk check raise bluffing turns, overbetting, making very large bluffs, etc. will likely be negative EV at first. You have to learn how to do them effectively, and when you start doing it, you'll likely make some big mistakes. While you should be as prepared as possible before you begin, there's no way around it. It's likely going to be negative EV as you learn new concepts. You find yourself in new, tougher spots you're unfamiliar with. Don't beat yourself up over a few mistakes. So you are investing in yourself. Ideally, you sort of grasp concepts of bluff raising, and following through well enough that it's plus EV as soon as you start doing it. But in reality, you're probably going to have to learn. And even if you make 5, bluffs that are like plus 4 big blinds in EV, if you end up just butchering a hand, you can throw that all away really quickly. It's okay for this to happen when you're learning how to do it. There's no real way around it. Mark your big bluffs and do not be results oriented. It's so easy to run good or bad in a few bluffs, and most of the time, bluffs are supposed to fail. Do not be results oriented with your bluffs. That will completely screw your game. If I make a $60 bet into an $80 pot on the river after raising my opponent's flop bet and betting the turn, it's supposed to fail. These are 100 no limit stack sizes, and you see this sizing on the river all the time. When you make that bluff, you lose you're going to end up losing 2.5 times more money for the hand if you make this bluff and fail than you will if you just check fold. But if it's a profitable bluff, you still need to be willing to make it, even though you might end up losing a stack. Yup, there goes one stack, and all because you wanted to win that $12 on the flop. But if the turn and river bluffs are plus EV, we need to follow through. So it's frustrating if you're new to this, where you're just trying to win a little bit of money on the flop, and then your opponent says no, and he calls. And then you're like, oh, that's a good turn bluff card. It, gives me some more outs. And then you bluff it, and then your opponent says no again and calls. And then you get on the river, it's a good card to maybe bluff the river, and your draw missed, you go all in, and you end up getting stacked, all because you just wanted to win that little flop pot. Tough. That's how poker works. That's how it's mathematically supposed to work. Be sure you're okay with this. But if we randomize well, sometimes we just hit, and it is awesome. I've been berated many times in chat from runnering and, the nuts when I bluff randomized well. It's pretty funny, and you win a stack. So awesome feeling, which you'll get if you start bluff raising a decent amount. Imagine you are playing some no-limit Texas Hold'em on the internet, and you open in middle position with pocket 8s in the button calls. The flop comes Jack 8-5 with 2 hearts. You bet, and your opponent calls. The turn comes 6 of diamonds, and you bet, and your opponent raises. What are you doing? I'm guessing you jam. Does this make sense in theory? Is it justified in practice? Why or why not? So take a moment and think about that. You probably want to pause and answer these questions. I know I say to pause a lot in my videos. I would really recommend this one in particular. Pause, answer the questions, then unpause and see what I have to say. So I'll give you a second to do that if you want. Okay, so first of all, what are you doing? I'm guessing you're jamming the 8s. If not, then we'll talk about that as well. But most people, I think, would jam the 8s here and think it's a pretty easy jam for 2 reasons. The first is the board texture is pretty wet. So they don't want their opponent to outdraw them on the river or get scared on the river, so they want to go all in now. The second is because people don't bluff raise enough on the turn. So if people don't bluff raise enough on the turn, you don't really need to slow play. So those are the main 2 reasons why I think people are just going to jam on the turn here in practice when they have pocket 8s and their opponent raises. Does this make sense in theory? Now this one's a little bit more complex because this is a very wet board texture, so giving your opponent free cards by calling, free cards relative to after he's already raised, that is pretty risky. Because even if the opponent's bluffing, he probably has some outs. But by the same token, if the opponent's raising the turn with a range of nuts or air, because he's probably raising this turn with either 2 pair or better, or, a complete bluff, does it really make sense to jam against that range? Because that range is already so polarized, there might not be much of a reason to jam against an already extremely polarized range. Mathematically, when you call the turn, that makes the opponent fall through on the river more often because you get such a good price on your turn call. Since this board texture is wet, it's a little bit of a more complex one, but for the most part, you can hopefully see how calling on this turn can make a lot of sense. In practice, though, your opponent's probably not bluff raising the turn, and your opponent probably doesn't have enough 7-9s where it's, you need to worry about being behind here. So jamming the turn with pocket 8s is probably going to be completely fine. So think about this for a second. Just because we can bet the turn and when our opponent raises we can go all in and feel really good about it doesn't mean we can't exploit other players who do this. If we are now not the player with pocket 8s, if we're now the button and we're the one bluff raising on the turn, then if our opponent calls, he probably either has a draw that thinks he's getting odds to call and hit on the river, Or he has some sort of overpair that he's not willing to fold yet, but he'll fold when we fall through on the river. So there's a lot of ways to exploit nits in spots like this by saying, okay, this board texture is wet enough that if we bluff raise this turn and the opponent calls, I think when we fall through on the river, he's almost always going to fold. Think about what you do in spots and how you can exploit other players using the same exploitative line. It's really not that hard to manipulate another regular. Don't be scared. So this is a good example of a spot to manipulate your opponent, and if they call your turn raise, you're probably going to be able to fall through on a lot of rivers really, really profitably. If you find you're wrong and he makes a very good play against you, just take a note. I would be very surprised if most players flat a hand like 7-9 after I raise the turn against them. So that's going to be really, really effective against me, because I would probably bluff the river way too much if I raised the turn and they called, because I don't think they would slow play on a dry board. So when that happens to me, I'll just take a note. Stop caring about initiative at No Limit 100. Initiative is the most overrated concept in poker. It pretty much means nothing, but most players assign an incredibly high value to it. Remember, 90% of players play No Limit 100 or lower. I actually imagine it's a lot more than 90%, but I just threw that number down. So most players are playing very low limits where they assign a high value to initiative. It's time for you to stop caring. Learn how to donk bet and learn when donking makes sense theoretically. Likewise, you should also learn to stop continuation betting any two cards, especially against opponents who can bluff raise. Don't recklessly bet out of position on flops if you can't likely get 3 streets of value. This should start at lower than No Limit 100, but it's hard to do before you understand donk betting and frequencies better. What is the point in betting Queen Jack on a Queen 8-4 board just to have to check and guess on the turn or river? Sometimes it can make sense, but it usually doesn't. Think about that. If you're out of position on a Queen 8-4 board and you bet the flop and your opponent calls, and you bet the turn and your opponent calls, in a lot of positions you're not going to be able to value bet the river. So you end up having to check, and then now you kind of have a bluff catcher and you're in a really undesirable spot. So consider checking on the flop to begin with. Betting the flop out of position, whether it be donk betting or continuation betting, it really doesn't matter that much. How wide does the opponent need to felt if we bet the flop out of position? What if we bet all 3 streets, only 2 streets? How does this compare to check raising? What hands work best as bluffs as out of position bets? What hands work best as check raise bluffs? Suppose the button opens and you flat in the big blind. What boards are good overall to donk bet and what boards miss your range overall? What ratio of bluffs to value bets do you need when donk betting? You do not need to be good at donk betting yet, but you need to start thinking about it and figuring out why betting as the cold caller is so effective with the right types of hands on the right types of boards, and recklessly betting as a preflop raiser is not effective. It's a habit most people have, which is they just recklessly bet as a preflop raiser, but it's not one they should have, and it's one you should try to break. So, a very lot of information on this slide, and unfortunately it's not going to be something I have enough time to go into now. If you're playing No Limit 100, this should be something you're starting to think about, though. You're starting to think about not recklessly betting as a preflop raiser, and then when you are the cold caller, when you should be donking. There's going to be a lot more videos released about it from me this year for how to play out of position, and I've already made a donk betting series. Check that out if you're at around this limit and you're trying to move up. It's probably something useful to start thinking about. Improved fundamentals. Know your frequencies. They aren't hard to learn, and most frequencies I've already explained in other videos. What percentage of flop bets should be for value when you're betting the flop? What percentage of turn bets should be value when you're betting the turn after betting the flop? How strong does a hand need to be to get 3 streets of value on a flop in position? 2 streets, 1 street. If you raise a flop c-bet when you're in position, how wide is the opponent faulting relative to simply calling down? So, what I mean by that is, if your opponent bets on the flop, and you raise, and you fall through on the turn, and you fall through on the river, how much does he have to felt? Whereas if he goes bet, 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 and you simply call down, then how much does he have to felt? Because by raising, you're going to make his range on the river much stronger. That's incredibly important to think about when you're debating whether or not to value raise like an ace-queen or an ace-king hand on an ace-high board. You might be better off calling down because you might find that even though, your hand is very strong, when you value raise the flop and you fall through on the turn and on the river, you make his range so strong that you would have been better off simply calling down yourself, keeping his range wide, and making it easier for him to bluff. It's important to start understanding these things, and most of these frequencies are pretty easy to memorize. Acknowledge which spots are close and think about these frequencies when determining what lines to take. Is it better to continuation bet 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts on a queen 10-4 board, or check call with it? What variables determine this? So this is in the important theory concepts series that I made. Think about what kind of variables determine whether or not this hand's going to be better as a bluff or better as a check call or a check fold. It's important to understand these things. And once again, I know there's a lot of information here, but it's way too much for me to go into in a quickie. This is the kind of stuff you should be trying to learn, and it's elsewhere if you still don't know it yet. No limit 100 summarized. We must now begin implementing the more difficult poker concepts. Pulling big bluffs against the right opponents and making sure we randomize bluffs well against mediocre targets. So we're not always going to be playing opponents that have these super obvious huge leaks where we can just take whatever line crushes them based on their leak. Sometimes we're going to be playing against opponents who are actually decently good, and then we just need to randomize well. Other times we'll be playing against nits who we think we can make fold a pretty big hand, or even against relatively good regulars who we think we can make fold a pretty big hand, and we're going to just have to be willing to make a big bluff even though it's very risky. We need to start donk betting and not recklessly betting as a preflop raiser. Bet should mean something. Stop caring so much about initiative. It is good to use it exploitatively, but it has to actually be exploiting the opponent and not just an excuse to be lazy and take an easy line. Once again, when we bet, it should really mean something. We're accomplishing something with the bet. We're not just doing it because it makes the hand easier to play. So, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as usual, please give me comments and feedback in the forums. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say and what you guys think is important for beating No Limit 100. So, good luck, everyone. Bye.
Want to see your hands in the quickie? Convert your hand history using the CR converter or post it in the forums. Send your link or questions to thequickie@cardrunners.com. Please include all relevant reads, stats, and information. The more info you provide, the more likely you'll be selected.